Hi everybody, this might be a little bit of a long video. We're going to cover these four topics. We're going to construct a cumulative frequency table from a frequency table. Then we're going to take that table and construct a cumulative frequency diagram. Then I'll show you how to read the cumulative frequency diagram to estimate frequencies of unknown values or values that might have particular frequencies. And then we'll lastly construct a box and whisker plot. So here's our data that we're going to be dealing with. So x is a random variable and it takes on values in these intervals. And there are 6 items between 10 to 12, 14 items between 12 to 14, and so on and so forth. So this is our frequency column. To this, we're going to add a cumulative frequency column. So I'll use CF to represent cumulative frequency. Now, the cumulative frequency is the sum of all of up to and including this frequency. So for the first row, it matches. So the frequency and the cumulative frequency match in the first one. The second one, it's going to be this 14, but we'll add the 6. So it'll be 20. So it's essentially the sum of all of them. Next, we'll have 19 plus 14 plus 6. We've already done 14 plus 6 for 20. So we'll take the cumulative frequency before, we'll add the frequency of the next, and we'll get to 39. Now, if I told you the last frequency here was 60, and we worked backwards, we could take the previous cumulative frequency, subtract the previous frequency, and get the last cumulative frequency of 50. So 39 plus 11 is 50, 50 plus 10 is 60, and there's all sorts of little tricks that questions like to do with that sort of concept. So that's one additional column we need to add. Another column we need to add is we need to add our mid-interval column. So I'm just going to call this mid, and I'll take the midpoint of each of these. So my mid of 10 to 12 is 11, then 13, then 15, then 17, and then 19. It's these mid-interval and cumulative frequencies that are going to become points on my cumulative frequency diagram. So these are the two columns that I would add to my cumulative frequency table. And now let's move on to the second part. Because we've constructed a cumulative frequency table, we know how those work. So the second part is constructing a cumulative frequency diagram. So I'll just move this up slightly, and I'll start constructing my diagram. Now, I don't have a ruler, but fortunately, I always keep a good supply of stakes around. I'll draw myself an axis without knocking over my camera. Now, along my x-axis, I'm going to include values from my intervals. So I'll probably go up by 2s at a certain point. But the first thing I'm going to do is I am going to include a 0. And I'm going to include a line break. Because I don't need to show necessarily every value. I know the smallest possible value of x is 10, because there's nothing below 10. So that'll be the first value that I show here, 10. And then I suppose it makes sense to go up by 2s. So using my magical ruler and not breaking any of my own rules, I'll have 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20. I suppose I could add 22. Now, this is my observation or my x column. And this column up here is my frequency column or my cumulative frequency column. Now, I know that in total there are 60 elements. I like to sometimes just think about the cumulative frequency column as going from 0 elements all the way up to the total amount of elements. So I'll put 60 up top. Now, halfway between 0 and 60, should be right about there. And that'll be 30. Actually, I'm going to go down one number so that I can use an even number of lines. Do a little quick change here, just so that way 30 ends up nicely on a line here. So there's 60, and there is 30. Now I can fill in the rest of my scale. Here's 15, here's 45. Halfway between 45 and 60 would be 52.5, but I don't need to show everything on all my axes. Okay, now that I have my axes set up, remember this was my total number of observations and that starts at 0. I'm going to go ahead and plot points. Now the points I'm going to plot come from my mid-interval value and my cumulative frequency. So at 11, I'm going to plot 6. So 11 would be here, and 6 would be somewhere in between. Because remember, between 0 and 15 is about 7.5, so 6 would be somewhere close to that. My next point would be at 13 and 20. So that looks to be about there. My next point would be at 15 and 39. So that looks to be about there. My next point would be at 17 and 50. Looks to be about there. And my last point will be at 19 and 60. So that looks to be about there. Now, obviously, had I chosen better values for my axes, I could have plotted these points more reasonably, but you'll see in a moment why I've chosen the points of 60, 45, 30, and 15. Now, I can add one more point. Because from before I knew that no value was less than 10, I know that at 10, there's a point of 0. So I can connect my cumulative frequency graph down to that point on the x-axis. And now I just draw a curve connecting these points. And there's my cumulative frequency graph. Now, these curves will be different shapes. They'll have different steepnesses. It's important not to draw them with a straight line. We can't assume it's a straight line in between any one point. But if we were to zoom in, we would see that it kind of acts like a straight line between those points. Okay, so that's a cumulative frequency graph generated. Done. Next, we're going to estimate using the diagram. So suppose I wanted to know how many items were less than whatever 16 was. I could go to 16 and I could use a dotted line and draw up. And it looks like whatever X was, maybe X was, I don't know, length of hand, or maybe X was age. It looks like there's 45 items that are under 16. Because if I go to 16, well, 16 is the 45th item. Now, I can go even further than this. I can do from backwards. So I can say, okay, well, about 30 of the items, so remember, these are all my items. X fits into all these categories. 30 of them, if I start from 30 and draw over, are about below 14. Maybe that's 15. Yeah. Now, the reason why I chose these particular values here of 60, 45, 30, and 15 is, well, if this is 100% of the data and this is 0% of the data, then this is half of the data. And this would be 3/4 of the data. And that would make this 1/4 of the data. So in fact, these are my values of my first quartile, my median, or Q2, and my third quartile. So those are the values of my first, second, and third quartiles. Now, these are just estimates, obviously. They're not exactly the right answers, but pretty good estimate by hand. Now, what I can do with this is I can actually extend these lines either below my diagram, or in this case, I'll extend them above my diagram so that I can create a box and whisker plot, because that was the last thing I needed to do. So that's the first quartile, the median, and the second and the third quartile. And then I'll extend to my last piece of data, which occurred at 20. And I'll go ahead and put a whisker. And I'll extend back to my first piece of data, which was at 10. And I'll go ahead and put a whisker there as well. And so now I've used this cumulative frequency diagram to construct a box and whisker plot. Hopefully that video has been somewhat helpful.